April 22, 1945. Berlin, the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, mid-afternoon. Adolf Hitler stood in the conference room 30 feet below ground level, listening to reports from his military commanders about the Soviet breakthrough north of Berlin, about German defensive lines collapsing throughout the city's outskirts, about the impossibility of assembling relief forces strong enough to break the Soviet encirclement, and about the military situation that made clear Berlin would fall within days, regardless of what orders Hitler issued or what fantasies he entertained about non-existent armies coming to rescue the capital and to reverse Germany's imminent defeat in the war Hitler had initiated nearly 6 years earlier with invasion of Poland, and that was now ending with Soviet artillery shelling the Reich Chancellery, and with Soviet infantry fighting block by block through Berlin's streets toward the bunker where Hitler had retreated from the reality he could no longer deny through willpower or through rage against subordinates he blamed for failures. The moment when Hitler finally accepted that Germany had lost the war, that his Reich would not last 1,000 years but would die with him in the ruins of Berlin, came during this conference when General Wilhelm Burgdorf reported that SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner's forces, which Hitler had ordered to attack southward and relieve Berlin, did not exist in strength Hitler had imagined. That Steiner commanded perhaps a few thousand men, rather than the divisions Hitler's maps showed, and that no relief was coming because no German forces remained capable of offensive operations against Soviet armies that outnumbered and outgunned defenders by overwhelming margins. Hitler was 56 years old, but appeared decades older, from his health destroyed by years of stress and by medications. His personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, had prescribed in quantities that left Hitler physically dependent and mentally unstable. His left hand trembled uncontrollably from what may have been Parkinson's disease. His posture was stooped, his face was pale and lined, and his once commanding presence had diminished to the appearance of a sick old man shuffling through underground corridors, giving orders to armies that no longer existed and planning counterattacks that could never be executed. The bunker complex where Hitler spent his final days consisted of 2 levels. The upper Führerbunker, where staff worked and slept, and the lower Führerbunker, where Hitler maintained his personal quarters, a small conference room, and the claustrophobic spaces that would become his tomb. The air was stale despite ventilation systems, the concrete walls were damp, the lighting was harsh and artificial, and the atmosphere was one of desperation mixed with denial, as the people trapped underground with Hitler oscillated between hoping for miracles and preparing for death. The context that made Hitler's situation in April 1945 so extraordinary was how completely the military position had reversed from Germany's peak power in 1942, when German forces controlled territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the Caucasus Mountains, and when Hitler's empire represented the largest German domination of Europe since Charlemagne. 3 years of warfare had destroyed the Wehrmacht through battles of attrition on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces had gradually pushed German armies westward at enormous cost, through Allied strategic bombing that had devastated German cities and crippled industrial production, through the Normandy invasion in June 1944 that opened a second front in France, and through Germany's fundamental strategic overextension, fighting simultaneously against the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain and their allies, while lacking the economic resources and manpower to sustain wars on multiple fronts against enemies with superior industrial capacity. By April 1945, Germany's defeat was mathematically certain and militarily inevitable. Soviet forces had captured Berlin's outskirts and were fighting toward the city center against desperate German defenders who included old men from the Volkssturm militia and teenage boys from the Hitler Youth pressed into service because trained soldiers were dead or captured. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were advancing eastward through western Germany against minimal resistance. German industrial production had collapsed under Allied bombing. Fuel shortages made military operations nearly impossible. food distribution systems had broken down and civilian morale had disintegrated as Germans recognized that the war was lost and that Nazi propaganda about wonder weapons and final victories was delusional fantasy rather than realistic assessment. Hitler's response to military catastrophe was to retreat into the Führerbunker in January 1945 and to increasingly detach from reality through constructing alternative universe where willpower could overcome material disadvantages, where loyalty to National Socialism mattered more than military capability, and where Germany's defeat resulted from betrayal and weakness rather than from fundamental strategic mistakes Hitler himself had made. His daily military conferences became exercises in fantasy where Hitler moved non-existent divisions on maps, planned counterattacks with forces that had been destroyed weeks earlier, and raged against generals who tried to explain military realities that contradicted Hitler's imagination. The people trapped in the bunker with Hitler during these final days represented a mixture of true believers who remained loyal despite recognizing that Germany had lost, opportunists hoping to survive by staying close to Hitler, and those who simply had nowhere else to go as Soviet forces surrounded Berlin. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, who had served Hitler since the 1920s, had moved his family into the bunker and had made clear his intention to die with Hitler rather than face capture or attempt escape. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, maintained bureaucratic functions and jockeyed for position even as the Reich collapsed. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, whom he would marry 2 days before their joint suicide, had arrived in Berlin against Hitler's orders and insisted on staying with him until the end. Military officers, including Wilhelm Burgdorf and Hans Krebs, continued presenting situation reports and executing orders they knew were meaningless. And staff members, including Secretaries Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, valet Heinz Linger, and bodyguard Rochus Misch, maintained routines of serving Hitler while preparing psychologically for death or capture. The explosion of rage that witnesses described Hitler displaying during the April 22nd conference when he finally accepted that relief was impossible represented the moment when denial cracked and reality penetrated the fantasy world Hitler had constructed. According to accounts from people present, Hitler screamed that he had been betrayed by the Wehrmacht, that the generals were cowards and incompetents, that the German people had proven themselves unworthy of him and deserved destruction, and that he would remain in Berlin and die rather than flee to Bavaria or attempt escape. The outburst lasted perhaps 30 minutes, with Hitler pacing the conference room, shouting accusations, and finally collapsing into his chair, declaring that the war was lost and that he would shoot himself. The declaration that he would commit suicide rather than attempt escape or face capture represented fundamental shift from Hitler's previous statements that he would lead final defense of Berlin or would die fighting at the head of German troops. Those around him attempted to convince Hitler to fly south to Berchtesgaden, where some German forces remained and where continuing the government might be possible. But Hitler refused all such suggestions with statements that leaving Berlin would mean abandoning his mission and accepting humiliation he could not endure. The decision to die in Berlin was presented as loyalty to the German people and as fulfillment of duty, but it also reflected Hitler's personality and his inability to imagine existence without power and without the adulation he had demanded throughout his political career. The days following the April 22nd breakdown followed a pattern of alternating hope and despair as Hitler oscillated between fantasy of last-minute salvation and preparation for death. Military conferences continued with Hitler studying maps and issuing orders to armies that no longer existed or that had been destroyed in battles fought days earlier. He dictated instructions for defending Berlin block by block, ordered executions of officers accused of defeatism or cowardice, and planned counterattacks that his own generals knew could never be executed. But he also made preparations for suicide by testing poison on his dog, Blondie, by dictating his personal and political testaments that would serve as his final statements to history. and by marrying Eva Braun in a brief ceremony conducted past midnight on April the 29th. The political testament Hitler dictated revealed the complete absence of self-awareness or acceptance of responsibility that characterized his response to Germany's defeat. The document blamed Germany's catastrophe on international Jewry, who Hitler claimed had caused the war, on traitors within Germany who had undermined the war effort, and on the weakness of German people who had failed to rise to the historical challenge National Socialism presented. There was no acknowledgement that Hitler's decisions to invade the Soviet Union, to declare war on the United States, to divert resources toward genocide rather than military production, or to maintain impossible military positions rather than conducting strategic retreats, had contributed to Germany's defeat. There was no recognition that his leadership had led Germany to destruction rather than to the greatness he had promised. Instead, Hitler portrayed himself as prophet who had understood historical forces, but who had been undermined by others' failures and betrayals. The testament also revealed Hitler's continued obsession with anti-Semitism and his determination that his final political statement emphasized the racial ideology that had motivated Nazi policies throughout the regime's 12-year existence. Hitler wrote that he had sought war against neither Britain nor America, that international Jewry had forced war upon Germany, and that future generations must continue the struggle against Jewish influence. The passage demanded that German leaders maintain racial purity and continue fighting against Judaism, demonstrated that even facing death and recognizing military defeat, Hitler remained committed to ideological framework that had justified the Holocaust and that had motivated policies resulting in millions of deaths. The final hours on April 30th, 1945, followed rituals that combined bureaucratic formality with preparations for death that those present found surreal given the circumstances. Hitler had lunch with his secretaries and with Eva Braun, speaking about trivial matters and maintaining conversational tones that contradicted the reality that Soviet forces were fighting perhaps blocks away and that artillery shells were landing near the Reich Chancellery. He said goodbye to staff members with handshakes and expressions of gratitude for their service, maintaining composure that contrasted with the breakdown he had displayed 8 days earlier. He retreated to his private suite with Eva Braun around 3:30 p.m., and approximately 30 minutes later, his valet Heinz Linger and others entered to find Hitler dead from a gunshot wound to the head, and Eva Braun dead from cyanide poisoning. The bodies were carried upstairs to the Reich Chancellery garden, placed in a shell crater, doused with gasoline, and burned according to Hitler's instructions that his body not fall into Soviet hands and not become trophy or object of display. The cremation was hasty and incomplete, with Soviet forces so close that those conducting the burning had limited time and limited fuel to complete the task. The partially burned remains were later discovered by Soviet forces, identified through dental records, and eventually disposed of in ways Soviet authorities kept secret for decades, denying Hitler the grave or monument that might have become shrine for neo-Nazi movements. What Hitler said inside the bunker as Berlin closed in revealed personality and psychology that help explain both his rise to power and the catastrophic consequences of his leadership. The rage he displayed during conferences when reality contradicted his plans showed inability to accept limitations or to modify strategies based on circumstances rather than on will. The alternation between grandiose planning and suicidal despair revealed emotional instability that medications had exacerbated but had not created. The complete absence of empathy or responsibility for suffering. His policies had caused demonstrated sociopathic personality that could order millions killed without apparent emotional reaction while raging against subordinates for minor failures or perceived disloyalties. But Hitler's statements during those final days also revealed the human being beneath the monster, the failed artist and frustrated intellectual who had found power through exploiting post-World War I German resentments and through constructing political movement based on racial ideology and nationalist mythology. His conversations with secretaries about dogs and about trivial domestic matters showed capacity for ordinary human interaction that contrasted grotesquely with orders he simultaneously gave for executions and for scorched earth policies that would destroy German infrastructure and would cause German civilians deaths. His marriage to Eva Braun, hours before their joint suicide, suggested desire for conventional human connection, even while rejecting all conventional moral constraints that might have prevented policies of genocide and aggressive war. The alternative scenarios that might have emerged from different decisions reveal how Hitler's personality and ideology constrained his choices and made peaceful resolution of Germany's defeat impossible. If Hitler had committed suicide in early April or late March, when Germany's military position became hopeless, thousands of German soldiers and civilians might have survived who died during the final weeks of fighting that served no purpose except satisfying Hitler's determination not to surrender. If Hitler had fled to Bavaria or had attempted escape, Nazi resistance might have continued longer, but German suffering would likely have been prolonged rather than reduced. If Hitler had accepted surrender and had faced trial as German and Japanese leaders later faced trials for war crimes, his capture might have provided clearer historical closure and might have prevented some of the mythology that later developed around his death. But Hitler's suicide was consistent with his personality and with Nazi ideology, emphasizing will and determination over acceptance of defeat, and attempting to imagine Hitler accepting capture and trial requires imagining different person with different psychological makeup than the historical Hitler possessed. The broader question of what Hitler's final days reveal about totalitarian systems and about personality cults connects his individual psychology to structural features of Nazi Germany that enabled one man's decisions to produce such catastrophic consequences. The Nazi system had eliminated institutional checks on Hitler's power through destroying parliamentary democracy, through establishing Führerprinzip that made Hitler's word law, through creating overlapping bureaucracies competing for Hitler's favor rather than constraining his decisions, and through promoting ideology that portrayed Hitler as infallible leader whose instincts transcended rational analysis. These structural features meant that Hitler's increasingly delusional military strategy during 1944 and 1945 could not be challenged effectively by subordinates who recognized that his orders were leading to disaster, but who had no institutional mechanisms for overruling him, and who faced execution if they opposed his decisions too openly. The cult of personality surrounding Hitler had convinced millions of Germans that their Führer possessed superhuman capabilities and that Germany's fate depended on maintaining absolute loyalty regardless of circumstances. This psychological investment in Hitler's leadership made German resistance to Nazi policies difficult, even when those policies were manifestly failing, created incentives for subordinates to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear rather than providing accurate information, and produced the atmosphere of fantasy and denial that characterized the bunker during April 1945, when people who recognized rationally that Germany had lost continued acting as though victory remained possible, because acknowledging defeat meant acknowledging that everything they had believed and everything they had done in service of National Socialism had been based on lies. The Holocaust continued operating until literally the final days of Nazi Germany, with concentration camps still murdering prisoners even as Allied forces approached and even as German military position was hopeless, demonstrated that Nazi ideology's racial component was more fundamental than strategic military considerations. Resources devoted to genocide could have been used for military purposes. Transportation used to deport Jews to death camps could have been used to move military supplies, and personnel assigned to camps and to Einsatzgruppen could have served in combat units. But Nazi leadership, including Hitler, prioritized racial extermination over military effectiveness, revealing that Nazi ideology was not simply nationalism or German expansionism, but was fundamentally centered on racial theories that made mass murder central goal, rather than unfortunate byproduct of other policies. Hitler's suicide, rather than facing capture and trial, meant that he escaped direct accountability for his crimes and that he avoided the public humiliation of facing victims and facing historical judgment while alive. But his suicide also represented ultimate failure and recognition of defeat that his ideology had claimed was impossible for those with sufficient will and determination. The man who had promised Germans a 1,000-year Reich and who had claimed that National Socialism represented highest stage of human evolution died in a bunker surrounded by ruins of the capital he had sworn to defend. Having led Germany to its worst military defeat in history, and having left Germans facing occupation, partition, economic devastation, and moral reckoning with crimes committed in their name. What Hitler said inside the bunker as Berlin closed in was that he had been betrayed, that Germans had proven unworthy of his leadership, that Jewish conspiracy had caused his defeat, and that future generations must continue the racial struggle he had led. These statements revealed man incapable of self-reflection, unable to accept responsibility for catastrophic consequences of his decisions, and committed until death to ideological framework that had motivated his political career and that had justified policies resulting in perhaps 50 million deaths worldwide. They revealed the psychology of totalitarian leadership, where reality must conform to ideology rather than ideology adjusting to reality, where failure is always someone else's fault, and where maintaining psychological consistency matters more than acknowledging truth. And they revealed the human capacity for self-delusion and for moral blindness that allows individuals to cause immeasurable suffering while portraying themselves as victims and as servants of higher historical purposes that justify any atrocity.